Hi, I'm Tom Anderson. This is my channel, Anderson Alternative. This is a brand new channel, just started it today. So this is my first video. I want to tell you a little bit about myself and what I'm doing here and how I think I can help you, the viewer, to maybe implement some of the things that I've been doing in your own life. So Anderson Alternative, alternative what? I guess alternative lifestyle in general, but most specifically alternative energy and alternative building practices. What you see behind me there is my off-grid house. It's 3,200 square feet. It operates on a 3.2 kilowatt solar array and a 1 kilowatt wind turbine, which is not a lot of energy for a 3,200 square foot house. In fact, you might not think that it looks much like a solar house at all, because we haven't taken the design principles that you see in most solar structures, which are very modern design elements. We went with more of a Gothic and classical Victorian feel. But it's a passive solar house, so we utilize various passive solar techniques. Like I said, we do have several energy systems in there for electricity. We also have multiple redundant systems for heating. We probably have in total dozens or maybe even hundreds of technologies and techniques in this house. And at some point I'd like to probably go through each one of them in a separate video. But for right now, this is just an introductory video, and I want to tell you a little bit about me and why I started this project and what else I've been doing that got me here, and where I intend to take it in the future. If at any point in time you think that this kind of information would interest you, please do subscribe and click the bell icon to get notifications when I do upload new content. I'm going to try to upload content as often as possible. I don't know how often that'll be, because I am actually a pretty busy person. My full-time career is as a software engineer, and I also do a lot of other things, I guess you could say, on the side. I'm not necessarily defined by my career like some people are. I'm more of a jack of all trades, a Renaissance man, a polymath. I like to keep my fingers in a lot of different pots and keep a lot of different stokers in the fire. So some of the other things I do is I am a certified and sworn law enforcement officer at Pennsylvania State Constable. I'm an EMT. I run a consulting business for web development and other software development. I teach university classes on off-grid building and sustainable building practices. I try to do as much training as I can. I have a bachelor's degree in computer science, and I'm currently going after a master's degree in cybersecurity. So, and I also have a family. So clearly I have a very full plate, but I have been building this house for going on, over 10 years. And the reason why it's taken so long is because, one, I'm doing it all myself. That's not to say that I haven't received some help now and then from friends and family, but I've literally touched every single component of that house, and I do it all on pretty much nights and weekends and holidays, because I do work full time and do all these other things as well, and also because it's basically an off-grid technology test bed. I started this project back in we started building in 2005. I started researching it in about 2004. And this was before the big boom in solar and off-grid technologies, after the 2008 collapse and all the tax cuts and tax credits, and various incentives for doing off-grid building and trying to revive the residential real estate market. Since that time, a lot of new information and technology has come out, but I started this project before all of that, and so the basis of my research was a lot of stuff done in the 1970s, a lot of things done previous to electricity even. I live out here in Amish country, and so I take some inspiration from the Amish and the things that they do, and the skills and techniques that they've carried forward from back when we didn't have electricity. Since the advent of electricity, we've really allowed ourselves to kind of get lazy in how we approach our design and engineering, HVAC in particular. Um, we used to have a lot of techniques around efficiency because we didn't have systems and technologies to fight the environment the way we do now with electricity. When we had everything manual and horse powered, we didn't really have the capability of being able to just like plop in a 5 ton uh, furnace or air conditioner to fight the fact that we've positioned our house wrong. We had to worry about passive solar principles. We had to worry about the wind and how the wind would draw energy away from a house. I liken it to jujitsu, which, if you don't know, jiu-jitsu is the martial arts style where you use your enemy's energies against them. So if they throw a punch at you, you redirect it into a throw instead of simply blocking and punching back, which would be more of a brute force method. So we've taken this brute force method in HVAC, in transportation, in a lot of different things that we do, and we're sort of trying to incorporate is just to rediscover some of these old techniques, things that go back even to like ancient Mesopotamia. They had techniques that I actually utilize in my house today, which were just lost for thousands of years. So what got me down this path? First of all, I guess probably the proximal event was 9/11. I lived in North Jersey with my girlfriend at the time, who's now my wife. She was going to school in Manhattan at the time, and I worked in Secaucus at a TV station, UPN 9, where I was the webmaster. And when the 9/11 event attack occurred, my wife was just going into school, and so she witnessed the plane hit the tower, and she tried to get out of the city. And they shut down the transportation system. So she actually managed to get on the last PATH train, which is the subway that runs under the Hudson River. She was on the last PATH train out of the city before they shut it down. And luckily she had family in Jersey City, because otherwise she would have been stuck there with nowhere to go. And likewise, I was in my office at the time, and obviously reporting, we lost our antenna on top of the World Trade Center. That's where our television station broadcast from. And so there was a mad scramble to figure out how we can get our signal out. And so we got it out through satellite to cable channels, and eventually we had it pushed over to the Empire State Building along with a lot of other New York stations. But for a while there, we were dependent on getting information out just through the web, so that was kind of on me. Back at that point in time, 2001, we didn't even have YouTube yet, and so we did try to get some streaming video up on our website, but it was more of a custom solution, and we weren't really ready for the kind of traffic and impact that would have. So, needless to say, I was pretty busy that day, and when I did finally finish up for the day and try to go home, well, they had Route 3, which is the only way in and out of Secaucus, because it's essentially an island in the middle of the Meadowlands. Route 3 was blocked, and they were, I guess, checking cars for potential terrorists. I don't know, but at that point in time, I was basically stuck on the island of Secaucus. My wife her fiance at the time was stuck in Jersey City. We couldn't get to each other. We couldn't get out. And at that point in time, it was kind of felt like, if the terrorists didn't get us, then, it might be our own government that prevented us from getting to safety. And I didn't really like the idea of living in close proximity to Manhattan anymore. I wanted to get out of the New York City metro area. So, I mean, that was kind of stewing for a little while. I really wasn't happy with that situation. And then, of course, the housing bubble was blowing up. I kind of saw that coming from a mile away. I actually started preparing my house for sale. Well, first of all, we started renovating the house back when we bought it in 2000. So when 2001 happened, we were in the middle of a project to replace. We took off the whole second floor, built a new second and third floor. And so at that point in time, we had to finish that project. But I saw the writing on the wall. I saw that the real estate market was blowing up, that it was going into an unsustainable bubble. And so, 2003-ish, I was really kind of antsy to get that project finished and the house on the market. The market probably didn't actually top until 2005, and then it kind of went sideways to slightly down 2006, 2007, 2008 before the whole thing crashed. But we were basically trying to get that place finished and sold, which we were doing even when we bought the property, which is here. And so this property, as you can see, is amazing views. We can see out about 30 miles in nearly every direction. And when we found this property, besides the fact that I wanted to get out of New Jersey, this is now central Pennsylvania here. Besides the fact that I wanted to get out of New Jersey, I did have a lot of these things kind of brewing in the back of my mind that I would like to be off the grid. I like the idea of being sustainable and all that. But when we found this property, there's no electricity up here. We're about 3/4 of a mile from the nearest pole, which is down there at the road near those houses down there. And it would have cost something like $25,000 or $30,000 to bring electricity up here. So, at that point, it was, if we're going to buy this house or buy this property, there was no house on it at the time. But if we were going to buy this property, we would have to either bring that electricity up from the grid and then pay for it for the rest of our lives, or we could potentially go off the grid. And so to me, that was kind of like a no-brainer. If we're going to buy this property, we're going to go off the grid. The gears started turning in my head as far as what I could do with it. And so I started researching to build this place before we even sold our house in New Jersey. So anyway, long story short, we did buy the property, we did sell the house in New Jersey, and we put the proceeds from that house into this one. And it's been an ongoing project for, since 2004 about. So 15 years thereabouts. So what are some of those other things that were brewing in my head that I kind of thought were good reasons why I'd want to go off the grid? And maybe you can use these because maybe you're unsure of why you might want to do it. It might be something that you feels appealing emotionally, but you don't really have necessarily a logical reason for it. Or maybe some logical reasons, but you want more ammo to convince your spouse or your friends or family that it's something that is doable, that you're not crazy for doing it. You might not think that Pennsylvania is the best place for going off the grid because it's not, the desert Southwest or the wilds of Alaska where they sometimes have people in cabins off the grid. But Pennsylvania, we're close enough to civilization where it's not necessary. I could have run power up here and paid the money for it. But it's also, there's no reason why this isn't a good place for it. We actually have a decent amount of sun. Despite the fact that it's overcast during much of the year, the latitude is actually pretty good. We're at the same latitude as about Rome, Italy. So if you think about how Germany and a lot of other European countries are trying to increase the amount of solar that they use, we're much better off latitude-wise as far as the amount of total insolation that we get at this portion of the Earth than Europe is. But we do have overcast skies quite a bit, so that is a consideration. And so we do have to have some alternative power sources besides solar. So I do have that wind back there. I do run a propane generator, and of course propane is not really off the grid and sustainable. So I do have things that are in the works to replace propane as a backup energy source. One of which is I'd like to build a biomethane digester. Another is I want to install thermoelectric chips on my fireplaces. Maybe a biodiesel generator, maybe fuel cells. So there's a lot of things that I'd like to do, and when I do those things, I'll make a video and walk through how I did it and how successful I was. And so hopefully, if that interests you, you'll subscribe to my channel. So what else? So it's a good investment. There's no carrying costs on this house. I have electricity, I have water, I have heat, and the only things that I pay for from outside the property are propane, and I buy a couple of tanks per year. The propane cost is minimal. I pay maybe $100 to $150 per tank. And I buy like 3 of them per year, and it's entirely backup. It's not necessary, but it's convenient and comfortable to have propane. So, I can use it for my cooking stove. I can use it for my dryer. I can use it as a backup heat source and a backup electrical source. But strictly speaking, if we wanted to, be a little more primitive and not have all those conveniences, we could do without the propane right now. But I don't want to live without the conveniences. I'm a techie. I like high tech things. I like comfort, and of course my wife and kids like comfort too. So we're not going to do without. We're going to make sure that we have different methods of backup, but I just want to make them completely sustainable. So we do have the propane right now. That's the only expense on this property other than property taxes and a mortgage payment. And so as soon as we get the mortgage paid off, then it'll just be property taxes, as long as we can get rid of that propane cost as well. We do have a septic system. We do have a well. And so everything's pretty much sustainable here. We harvest wood from the property. We do harvest a lot of food, not all the food, so that's another place where we need to become a little bit more sustainable, self-sufficient. We do have a lot of game on the property. We have hundreds of deer and turkey, but that's not something that I'm really gung-ho on doing right now. But I would like to get some chickens and some goats and maybe a cow, and definitely develop our fruits and vegetables, and then maybe even do some market gardening and generate more income off the property. I have generated some income off the property already with I sold some timber, got a couple $1,000s from that. I do tap my trees for maple syrup. I do lease my land to my neighbor, so my Amish neighbor down there actually takes care of all these fields for me, which is great because not only does he pay me, but now I don't have to take care of all like the noxious weeds and stuff. So it's really a win-win for me. And of course he gets to harvest all those crops off of there and sell them, so he makes a good living off of that too. All right, so what else? It's a good investment because there's no carrying costs, there's no expenses going forward, and that allows me to plan for the future more because I don't have to worry about necessarily having an income to maintain a standard of living going forward. So, I could lose my job, I could retire, I could go away on vacation and not have an income and know that, my house is still taken care of. I'm not going to lose electricity, I'm not going to lose heat, I'm not going to lose water, I'm not going to lose sewer. All that stuff's going to be provided. It's a pretty low maintenance house. That goes along with my general philosophy of, self-sufficiency and independence. I don't want to be a slave to my house. I don't want to be taking care of my house. I want my house to be taking care of me. And so, that's how, it's really a capital investment. I invest a little bit of money and effort up front, and then it invests back a lot of output that I can then consume without paying any taxes on it, which is another great thing. I don't have to pay any income tax on any income that I don't have to earn in order to pay for all the utilities, right? And then I don't have to pay any sales tax or fees or whatever kind of, I don't know, there's like a dozen taxes they throw in your utility bill these days. And so I can avoid all those things. And if I don't have to earn as much income, I can be in a lower tax bracket. So essentially I can retire and be in a low tax bracket and not need to pay income tax, not pay sales tax, and just live on my property and enjoy all the good things that life has without really suffering any drawbacks. So it offers, a lot more freedom. It's a form of financial independence without needing to be rich. A lot of times people think of financial independence as being so wealthy that you don't need to work. But on the other hand, if you can just reduce your expenses, your costs of living, then you can be financially independent without being necessarily rich in the way that most people think that you would need to be rich. If you can just pay your property taxes and a few incidentals, going out to eat every once in a while, maybe, having a few groceries that you buy versus the things that you produce on site. If you can live on, say, $10,000 per year or less, you can have a very, very small nest egg and make that last a long, long time. Okay, I came inside the house because the sun went away and it was getting kind of windy out and I was getting a little bit cold. You might wonder why I'm in a t-shirt in the middle of winter in Pennsylvania in the first place. That's part of my biohacking interests, and just another part of my alternative lifestyle. I don't know if you've ever heard of the Wim Hof method, but exposing yourself to a cold shock every now and then is actually something that stimulates autophagy and helps to recycle proteins and damage DNA and to repair your cells. I don't know how much I'll get into, biohacking on this channel. I might create another channel for that. But occasionally I might, be doing something weird like wearing a t-shirt outside in the middle of winter. But it was getting a little bit too tough to do that right now, so I did come inside. And I also wanted to reference my website where I talk about more of my motivations for, why I want to be off the grid. And so here's my website, andersonalternative.com. And this is basically just where I put all my class notes. So I do teach a couple of courses over at Bloomsburg University, and I keep my class information, my syllabus, my notes here for anyone to access. So if we click over on this case study in sustainable building, this is basically an overview of my entire house and all the different things that I put into it. And so talk a little bit about what is sustainable building. And then I do talk about my motivations for going off the grid. And so, some people might be motivated by like environmental reasons. I'm not really a greenie. I do care about the environment, and I don't want to see us pollute it. I do want to see us have a sustainable environment going into the future, but I do not particularly think that human activity is going to cause any sort of crisis, and so that's not my main reason for doing this. I'm more of a prepper mindset. As I said, with my experience with 9/11, I feel like bad events can happen that we're not prepared for, and that really got me thinking about society in general, and the different types of long tail events that can happen. Long tail event is if you think about a bell curve. Most of what happens occurs within the bell curve, and then you have these tails that go off to both sides, in which there's very low probability, rare events that occur, but they do occur. And there are things like, say, 100-year flood, which if it hasn't happened in 90 years, people think, oh, that can't happen. But it's a 100-year flood. It actually happens on average every 100 years. And so just because it hasn't happened in your lifetime or maybe even your parents' lifetime doesn't mean that things don't happen that can potentially upset our assumptions of what the world is like and what we should be prepared for. So you're talking about 100-year floods. We've only had the society that we have today for around 100 years. Since the advent of electricity, things have changed drastically, and population has taken off exponentially, and it's a different world than it was a century ago. And so we have what we consider these first world comforts that we take for granted, that we are owed them, that they're going to be around forever. But they are really dependent on a couple of things. And I liken this to a four-legged stool. The only things that are keeping us from the primitive third world subsistence, the state that we were in for 99.999% of human existence, and which much of the world still is, we depend on an electrical grid, a trucking and shipping system, a financial system, and factory farming. And factory farming, maybe you buy all organic stuff, right? But not everyone does. And if everyone did, then you wouldn't be able to buy the organic stuff that you buy, because all the people who buy the factory farm stuff for cheap would drive the competition for the few sources of organic foods that are available, and you'd have severe shortages, and it'd be extremely expensive. So even if you don't buy the factory farmed stuff, you are still dependent on it. And so if we lost factory farming, if we lost our financial system because of hyperinflation or some sort of global economic war, tariffs, even a hot war, all kinds of things. If the United States lost the reserve currency status of the dollar, our financial system could easily break down. We heard about these systemically important financial institutions, or SIFIs, back in 2008. And they were the too big to fail banks. And they were so interconnected that if one of them went down, then basically the entire financial system would collapse. Well, those financially, those systemically important financial institutions are bigger than they ever were, and they're more precarious than they ever were. If any one of them goes down, especially some of these ones that are like zombies right now, like Deutsche Bank, if these go down, then everything's going down. And when you knock one of these legs out of the stool, most likely other legs of the stool are going to get knocked out too. So if you knock out the financial system, how are you going to pay the truckers or the fuel? How are you going to maintain the electrical grid if you can't pay workers, if you can't buy the materials that you need to sustain those things? Um, if you can't get natural gas to produce the nitrogen-based fertilizers required for factory farming, if you can't get the diesel to run the tractors, these things will just all fall apart. And so you knock out one of these legs, you're probably going to end up knocking out more than one, and then the entire thing all collapses. And we are back into primitive third world subsistence. So it's a pretty scary thought. It may sound off the wall, but really there's so many things that can happen that we're just not prepared for. And like I said, we take it for granted. Maybe nothing will happen, but what if it does? And are you prepared for if it does? So, there's all kinds of risks to the grid, which I think is our primary concern. The electrical grid. If the electrical grid goes down, then we lose the financial system and the factory farming and the trucking and shipping, because, well, you need electricity to pump gas, and you need electricity to run computers. And so if you lost the grid, you would definitely lose the other elements of our system that we take for granted. These are some of the things that have hit us on a small scale in the past. We've seen supply and demand shortages, carbon caps, environmental regulations. We're hearing about this Green New Deal now that's supposed to basically upend all of society in order to make it green. But it would probably collapse the entire financial system. So, new energy taxes. And, you saw things like the Enron situation in California, a decade or two ago. Certainly, things that happened on a small scale recently could happen on a larger scale, or could be just the trigger, the straw that breaks the camel's back. Peak oil, we haven't heard as much about that recently, because the United States has become a much bigger player in oil now, because we have these shale resources. But globally, peak oil is still a thing. We might have put it off a little while, but the cheap, easy oil and gas has most likely been largely found. We are developing new technologies to get to the harder, more expensive gas and oil. There's a question, how long can we keep that going? Maybe indefinitely, maybe not. And so that's just another risk. We have the monetary policy. We saw this massive increase of Federal Reserve money printing after the 2008 financial crisis. And they said they were going to be winding down their balance sheet, but as soon as they tried in 2018, everything fell apart. And so they reversed that policy. They've been cutting interest rates again. And then since September, with the repo market going crazy, they have actually injected another several $100 billion into the system again. And so monetary policy is a very big risk right now. Monetary policy could easily send inflation out of control. We could have a hyperinflationary situation. And then you have the issue of, we're losing all of our retail industry. Stores are closing down like crazy, because we're going to this new online just-in-time model. And even the stores that are still out there, like Walmart and such, they only keep enough stock on hand in order to satisfy a few days worth of demand. And so you don't have this situation anymore where, like, you used to have hardware stores and grocery stores and various other retailers who kept potentially months worth of stock in the back that were just waiting to bring forward and to sell. They don't do that anymore. Now they only order just enough to meet what they think they're going to sell the next day or two. when we have any sort of a crisis, that 3 days of stock on hand could turn into 3 hours of stock on hand because people are rushing out to buy things like food and generators and things like that. Anytime you see a big snowstorm coming, you can witness aisles go completely empty in grocery stores, and so if you have a major crisis where trucking stops and you don't get new deliveries, well, we could run out of almost everything within a day or two. And so that's another really big risk. You also have this aging grid infrastructure. The electrical system in the United States is the oldest in the world, and being first has some drawbacks because it means that we are less maintained than the rest of the world too. The American Society of Civil Engineers in 2017 said that most of the electric transmission and distribution lines were constructed in the 1950s and 60s and only had a 50-year life expectancy. So most of the grid is actually beyond its designed lifespan. And on top of that, it's overloaded. We're running at full capacity on an aging grid. And so, how many machines do you know that can run at capacity or over capacity beyond their rated lifespan? This is it's a recipe for disaster. Eventually, this grid's going to fall apart. We don't know when or where. There's definitely triggers that could cause it, such as severe storms. We saw Superstorm Sandy back in 2012. Basically left a lot of people without power for months at a time, right through the winter. We saw in 2003, 50 million people were blacked out because some foliage fell on a line and caused a cascading failure. Every year, these utility companies have to spend $18 to $33 billion maintaining the grid. So what if we have a financial crisis? What if we have some sort of a situation where the utilities can't spend $18 billion to $33 billion a year anymore, and they allow parts of the grid to be less maintained? We may just get to that critical point where enough of it's not maintained that it just all falls apart. None of the grid's hardened against CMEs or EMPs. There was this Metcalf incident that probably very few people know about that happened in 2013. A small team of, like a SEAL team type of paramilitary group carrying AK-47s. They targeted these transformers near Silicon Valley, and they took out a few of them. But if they were successful in taking them out the way they wanted to, they probably would have crashed Silicon Valley. They would have made it dark, and they were probably betting short side on the NASDAQ. That's the thought process. But they weren't smart in how they targeted them, and so they were repaired quickly enough. But if they had targeted them just a few inches to the side of where they hit them, they could have prevented those things from being replaced for potentially months.
In the dead of night, a small team of gunmen attacked a U.S. power substation near San Jose. So it's a substation that feeds power to Silicon Valley. We had 19 minutes in which to shoot up key pieces of equipment. They completely knocked out the substation. And the fear now is that if they were part of a larger group, it would be possible to hit multiple substations and theoretically bring down the U.S. grid.
That is really incredible. Do they have any idea who is responsible for this?
Well, the FBI isn't talking for obvious reasons. They still haven't made any arrests. So we don't really know if they have a theory. People who were privy to the investigation in earlier periods say that they really didn't seem to have any good leads. So we hope that's not the case. We hope they'll catch the people.
Now, one of the people who's raising alarms about this is John Wellinghoff. He was the chairman of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission at the time. Why is he speaking out now?
I think that Mr. Wellinghoff, after the attack, he was extremely alarmed, and he went to a variety of federal agencies, Department of Defense, Homeland Security, the FBI, Congress, the White House, everywhere he could go, warning that this was a very serious attack, that this was an unprecedented attack, and that it required swift action. And he felt like he didn't get traction with it anywhere. One of the problems is there really isn't any agency that is responsible for the security of the U.S. grid. So as he put it, no one feels it's their job to do this.
It seems really incredible that an attack like this could happen on a really important power station and we would never hear about it. I mean, why didn't we know this was happening?
The utility, federal officials, and investigators all tried to keep the specifics out of the public attention. They didn't want to attract copycat attacks, and I think they really didn't want to telegraph to our nation's enemies that we have this vulnerability.
That could happen in New York on Wall Street. That could happen in Washington. A small team takes down a couple of transformers, and that can take out an entire section of grid. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission noted that if you could just destroy 9 interconnection substations and a transformer manufacturer, the entire U.S. grid would be down for at least 18 months. And in 18 months, that's at least one winter, right? And if you don't have the electrical grid for one winter, what are people going to do in the northern cities? If you don't have the ability to pump fuels, to run ventilation fans, you're not going to have heat, you're not going to have hot water, you're not going to have food, you're not going to have fuel. Basically, cities in the north, if they were without power for 18 months, would cease to exist. The populations would have to evacuate south. That's the only way that they could survive. We talked about physical attacks, but there's also cyber attacks. Actually, a lot of cyber attacks have happened all over the world, including, the United States has perpetrated cyber attacks, for instance, against Iran. We took out some of their centrifuges a while back with a worm. And there's no reason why Iran couldn't attack us back, or anyone else, whether it be Russia or China or Venezuela or anyone who the United States is pissed off for one reason or another. They could certainly attack us with some sort of a hack, some sort of a malware or Trojan or worm that could target our grid infrastructure, our nuclear power plants, our hospitals, our transportation infrastructure. All kinds of things would be taken out with a cyber attack. And being disconnected from the internet is not necessarily a measure of safety, because when we took out the Iranian centrifuges with the Stuxnet virus, they were already disconnected from the grid, from the internet. And the way that we got the Stuxnet virus into their system was to infect computers of the employees around that were associated with them, and they carried it into the facility where they were running these centrifuges to purify uranium. So if they can do that, if the United States can perpetrate that against the Iranians, there's no reason why the Iranians couldn't perpetrate that same thing against us. They could target malware to employees or families of employees, children of employees that operate critical infrastructure, and get these worms on thumb drives and laptops, and it eventually crosses into these systems that are not internet connected. No matter how careful you are, there are ways that you can get these cyber attacks through. And so that's a really big risk right now. We talked about CMEs a little bit earlier, and how it seems like it's something that could never happen. It's an event that happens in space. It's something that happens on the sun, and well, it's known to happen every 100 to 150 years. So if that's the average, 150 to 100 to 150 years, we know that throughout history that's happened by things we find in the soil that we can measure, or some sort of a historical record of astronomers for throughout the ages recording these things. If we know that these things happen, then it's bound to happen again. The Carrington event happened in 1859. It was a coronal mass ejection, which is basically a off-gassing from the sun when a solar flare throws the upper atmosphere of the sun out into space and it hits the Earth. That's a coronal mass ejection, and it can be equivalent to over 1 billion hydrogen bombs. So back in 1859, we didn't have an electrical grid, but we had telegraph systems, and those telegraph systems absolutely were fried. The pylons erupted in sparks and destroyed all the equipment that were attached to it. And so if that was the electrical grid today, essentially the entire electrical grid would be destroyed.
If a Carrington event was to occur today, the global damage to electrical and communication systems could be catastrophic. That's your mobile phone, your tablet, your laptop, your PC, power to your homes, schools, universities, hospital, industry, you name it. All these electrical and communication systems that we depend on so much could be at risk. The Carrington event occurred in 1859. Back in 2012, we had a near miss. The sun ejected a coronal mass ejection which missed us by 9 days.
Anything grid attached would be absolutely destroyed, and probably most buildings would burn down as a result of it as well. And this happens every 100 to 150 years. And 1859 was over 150 years ago. So we are overdue for another CME. It could literally happen anytime. It could happen tomorrow. Now, the way averages work, maybe it won't happen for another decade or 2 decades. We don't know, but it will happen sometime. And so we have to consider that that is going to eventually take down the grid at some point. An EMP is when a nuclear detonation occurs at high altitude. And what happens is that the neutrons that are emitted will create an electromagnetic disturbance in the upper atmosphere. And that will work kind of similarly to a CME, but it will work on smaller wavelengths. So where a CME will mostly just take out the grid, an EMP will also take out computers, cell phones, vehicles, and things with smaller electronics that a CME would not necessarily impact as strongly. We're not hardened against EMP at all. Basically, the entire grid would be taken down. All of our devices would be taken out.
Electromagnetic pulse that is created when a nuclear weapon is detonated high above the Earth's surface. The height at which the weapon would be typically detonated, the so-called height of burst, can range from 30 kilometers to 500 kilometers or higher. However, in order to generate significant weapon effects from all 3 components, i.e. E1, E2, and E3, the height of burst is typically 100 kilometers or higher above the Earth's surface. A high-altitude nuclear burst can illuminate a very large region, essentially a line of sight from the burst location. The exposed regions for the given burst heights from a nuclear burst over the central U.S. would extend across the continent, beyond the east and west coasts, and outside of our borders to the north and south. The E1 pulse resulting from a high-altitude nuclear explosion is a fast, narrow pulse with large amplitude. The unclassified E1 pulse is characterized by a rise time of approximately 10 nanoseconds, 10 billionths of a second, and peak amplitude of 50 kilovolts per meter. Although the E1 pulse is a significant electric field, such fields are often observed in extra-high voltage substations during switching or fault events. However, as will be discussed later, in the case of high-altitude EMP, these threat levels are experienced over a very wide area, thousands of square miles, as opposed to a small area within a substation. E1 can result in damage to electronic components either directly or by coupling to the attached wires or cables. The area of impact can be quite large, depending on the height of burst. However, as previously shown, due to the non-uniform nature of the threat, not all areas are impacted equally. The E2 waveform is produced in the intermediate times after the explosion. The time scale here is from 1 microsecond, 1/1,000,000th of a second, to about 10 milliseconds, 10/1000th of a second. The characteristics of the E2 waveform are similar to lightning. However, there are 2 important distinctions between E2 and lightning. First, it is important to understand that E2 does not attach itself to electric infrastructure in the same way that a direct lightning stroke does. As an example, a direct strike to a transmission tower. But rather it couples to electric infrastructure as a nearby lightning stroke would couple to a distribution line. Secondly, The peak amplitude of the E2 waveform has a peak amplitude of only 0.1 kilovolts per meter, far less than that of a typical lightning stroke and the E1 pulse that occurs immediately before the E2 pulse. As such, potential impacts to electronics and other power system components is expected to be minimal. The last portion of a high-altitude EMP event is referred to as an E3 waveform. There are two components to the E3 wave. One is referred to as the blast wave, or E3A, and the second is called the heave wave, for E3B. The blast wave is created within the first 10 seconds after the nuclear blast and as a result of the expanding fireball. The second component, the E3B heave wave, is generated by the heaving of air heated by the nuclear explosion. The change in geomagnetic field resulting from the E3A and E3B waves induces low-frequency, quasi-DC currents in the power grid, much like those generated by a severe geomagnetic disturbance event, but are significantly larger and of much shorter duration. The total duration of the E3A and E3B signals is on the order of 4 to 5 minutes. E3 has two potential impacts. 1. Voltage collapse due to increased reactive power consumption and misoperation of protection systems due to harmonics. And 2. Additional hotspot heating in transformers.
Almost every country in the world has the capability of launching an EMP attack. Certainly all the known nuclear powers, China, Russia, India, Pakistan, all of the NATO members that have nuclear weapons, they all have the ability to launch an EMP.
North Korea claiming it successfully tested a new medium-range ballistic missile capable of carrying a nuclear warhead. That is bad news. A preliminary assessment by the U.S. military says the KN-17 missile in the air for 30 minutes. It splashed down about 60 miles south of Russia's Vladivostok region, roughly 250 miles from Japan. And joining us now to assess the latest North Korean provocations, the potential of an electromagnetic pulse, or EMP, attack on this country. Joining us tonight, Dr. Peter Fry, the Executive Director of the Task Force on National and Homeland Security, the Chief of Staff of the Congressional EMP Commission, and it is great to have you with us, Peter. This is deeply alarming.
An EMP attack with a single warhead could shut down the electric grid across the entire country and cause a protracted blackout lasting months or years. Cars would be paralyzed. Airplanes could fall out of the sky. You'd have natural gas pipeline explosions, nuclear reactor overloads. And worst of all, if you had a protracted blackout, it would be a serious threat to the survival of the American people. We only have enough food to feed people in this country for 30 days.
And most other countries and terrorist groups, they can find a small nuke somewhere on the black market. And they don't need an ICBM to launch it either. They could do this with a weather balloon. They can launch a weather balloon from international waters and let it sail right over the central United States and then detonate it. And we would have no way of really knowing that that's what was going on. It would just suddenly strike and everything would be fried. And probably everything would be on fire. So, this is something we got to worry about. This isn't like a CME where it happens every so often, but an EMP is a risk that could happen the more we escalate things in the world. We just assassinated a Iranian general. And what is Iran going to do? They can't attack us, with a full frontal assault. They don't have the ability to do that. They can't just, send tanks and aircraft carriers because they don't have them. But they can launch an EMP. I'm sure that Iran has the capability. They've certainly been running their nuclear program for long enough where they could probably produce a weapon at this point. And even if they couldn't produce their own weapon, they could probably buy one. From the black market, from, old Soviet technology or North Korean or anyone else who has, something against the United States. They could probably get one. And so this is certainly something that could happen in the near future, or it might not. But it's another risk, another reason to be off the grid. And so, if the grid did go down, within 1 year, within one winter, something like 66 to 90% of the population will be dead. That's what the Congressional EMP Commission report said. This is a group that was commissioned to create a report on EMPs and our risks from EMPs. And what they said was that if the grid goes down, because we have this four-legged stool that will collapse, most of the population will die within a year. And I would say if we're close to winter, they're going to die within a couple months, because there's just no way of surviving in the northern cities or the northern states without the electrical grid right now. Most people do not have wood stoves. They do not have alternative heating sources that they could bring to bear if the electrical grid went out. So there's just not, if we have a small event like a hurricane or an earthquake, we have enough local, state, and national resources to address a small event. But even something the size of Hurricane Sandy, which was multiple states, that was a major issue. That was too much for our resources. They eventually we did get things back to normal, but it took months and months of time, and a lot of people suffered. But something that occurs on a national level, everyone across the entire nation is impacted simultaneously. There's really no way to bring any resources to bear that helps anyone except from outside the country and potentially outside the continent. If an EMP strikes North America, most likely Canada and Mexico are going to be impacted as well. So, this is something that we have to be concerned about, potentially being like an apocalyptic type of an event. It sounds scary, but the only people who are going to survive with a total grid down, like an EMP or a CME, are those who are off the grid. So, me up here in my off-grid house, my Amish neighbors, anyone else who's a prepper or is otherwise currently not dependent on civilization, those are the people that will survive most likely, although, I'm still dependent on some outside resources. I can't currently be completely independent. And so I would hope that we could reform a community and an economy if this type of thing ever happened. But it's important to be prepared. And the more people who are prepared, the more likely it is that we can all survive. And so one of the things that I hope to do with this channel is to help everyone get more prepared so that all of us can survive if possible. So I think that's just about all I want to talk about today. A little bit about who I am, what I'm doing here, why I'm doing it, how I hope I can help you to deal with these risks that we've talked about, to get the benefits of the capital investment, the financial security, and just to do things that are interesting, that are sustainable, that are good for the environment. If you're interested in this type of thing, like I am, then I hope that you'll subscribe to the channel and tune into future videos. Thanks for listening.